Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching TopTenzNet, and in the video today, we're looking at the top 10 things that would happen if everyone became a vegetarian.
Number 10. No more livestock. The current global demand for all kinds of meat is increasing, bolstered by both the planet's increasing population and the economic development of more impoverished countries. Here, the average meal is predominantly plant-based, but as these countries become more economically stable, so do its citizens have more access to meat as a primary food source. Already developed countries, on the other hand, seem to be slowly heading in the opposite direction, with their meat consumption having the tendency to slide down. At any given time around the world, there are roughly 1.4 billion cattle, 1.9 billion sheep and goats, 980 million pigs, and 19.6 billion chickens. In 2011, the world slaughtered almost 300 million cows, 947 million sheep and goats, 1.38 billion pigs, 2.8 billion ducks, 1.3 billion turkeys and geese, and a whopping 58 billion chickens. In overall meat consumption per person, Australia, the United States, and Israel lead the polls, with roughly 205, 200, and 190 pounds of meat respectively. At the other end of the spectrum are Bangladesh and India, with roughly 7.2 pounds each. One major reason why there's a smaller amount of meat eaten in this part of the world is because of Buddhism and Hinduism, which share the belief in rebirth and the importance of non-violence. These lead people to reject the slaughter and consumption of animals. Hypothetically speaking, if everyone were to become a vegetarian, many of these animals would logically disappear. Number 9. Replenishing the ocean fisheries. Up until the turn of the 20th century, the world's fisheries remained more or less unaffected by human consumption. Even though people had been fishing the seas and oceans for a very long time, only with the advent of modern technology did humanity manage to make a serious, unprecedented dent in the fish population. In 2014, the total capture amassed to about 93.4 million tons, a leveling off from the previous decade. However, this reflects the complete fishery collapse in many parts of the world and the impossibility for increased production, not that we reached any kind of equilibrium with nature. In total, we currently consume more than 160 million tons of fish per year, with the difference being supplemented by aquaculture, fish farming. Regardless of these fish farms, which have their own negative environmental impacts, it is estimated that by 2048 the oceans will be completely devoid of commercially viable fish. Number 8. Freeing up the land. As most of us know by now, roughly 70% of the planet's surface is covered by water. So, out of the 197 million square miles of the Earth, only about 58 million, that's 15 billion hectares, make up the dry land we currently inhabit. And out of that, 26% of ice-free terrestrial surface is made up of pastures and greenlands used for grazing livestock, some 3.4 billion hectares in total, more than the whole of Africa in fact. Large parts of these pastures, however, are in regions too dry or too cold for crop use and are sparsely inhabited. In addition to over a quarter of the Earth's total landmass being used for grazing, livestock also requires an additional 471 million hectares, a third of all arable lands, for growing feed. 80% of all corn and 95% of oat production in the US is feed. If all people became vegetarian, it wouldn't mean that all of this land would return to its natural state, since we would have to supplement our meat-based diet with a plant-based one. But we have to take into account the fact that at present day we are supplying our livestock with 77 million tons of human edible protein, and we are getting just 58 million tons in return. However, animal proteins do have a higher nutritional value to humans than the feed used for livestock. Number 7. Returning biodiversity. Surprisingly enough, livestock is a key factor in the loss of other animal species. To date, barnyard animals make up 20% of all terrestrial animals and now occupy vast areas once habitat to wildlife. It's fairly difficult to quantify all the effects livestock have on biodiversity. Not all effects are bad either, since grazing livestock help return naturally occurring grasslands to their original state and thus keep the habitat more or less intact. But the overwhelming numbers of cattle and sheep can pose some serious health concerns to the already existing wildlife. In many cases, like the Great Plains, cattle have taken over the habitat formerly belonging to bison and pronghorn antelope. Ranchers worldwide have also drastically reduced the number of predators, oftentimes leading to their total disappearance in the area. Moreover, pasture expansion into forest areas, together with grassland degradation, pose a serious threat to biodiversity. As the meat sector becomes more and more industrialized, it separates the animals from the actual land for large parts of the day, thus destabilizing the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle. Number 6. Decreasing air pollution. When we talk about air pollution and greenhouse gases, we usually refer to CO2 emissions. This isn't without cause, however, since the most predominant of these gases is, in fact, CO2. But unbeknownst to many is the fact that methane gas is up to 30 times more potent at trapping heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. And livestock around the world is responsible for 37% of all methane in the air. This makes up 18% of the entire global warming effect, more so than the entire transportation sector worldwide. Much of the methane and part of the CO2 is emitted from rumen fermentation and animal waste. The best and most efficient way for any average person to curb climate change, regardless of any government policies, is in fact to stop eating meat, especially red meat, as much as possible. Number 5. Conserving water. One of the biggest challenges we are about to face is freshwater scarcity. The effects have already begun to show themselves, predominantly on the west coast of the US, among other places. California, like much of the rest of the world, uses about 70% of its freshwater supply in agriculture, 20% in industry, and the remaining 10% for domestic and everyday use. However, out of all the water usage around the world, livestock directly accounts for 8%. The irrigation of feed crops and pastures represents 7% here, while the remaining 1% makes up for product processing and drinking water. These numbers, of course, are taken on a global scale, becoming more predominant in drier areas. In Botswana, for example, livestock drinking water accounts for 23% of all water use in the country. Another 15% of all water loss worldwide is attributed to evapotranspiration of feed crops. To put it in more relatable terms, each pound of beef requires 1,800 gallons of water to be produced, 1 pound of pork needs 720 gallons, and 480 gallons of water for each pound of chicken. Compare this with 191 gallons for a pound of cereal, 107 gallons for fruit, and 36 gallons for vegetables. Of course, a pound of any meat packs in much more calories than their weight equivalent in plant-based alternatives. However, by comparing the ratio of water per calorie, beef is still 5 times more water-intensive than fruit, 7 times more than veggies, and 20 times more than cereal. Number 4. Lowering our food security. Hypothetically, renouncing all meat throughout the world does have a few drawbacks. Being an omnivorous species, humans were able to be much more versatile when it came to their environment. Eating meat and animal-based products allowed humans to travel all across the globe and inhabit most of it. Without eating meat, humans would have never been able to reach and survive the Arctic regions of the world, and would have probably never crossed into the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge so long ago. Even today, in our technologically advanced society, many people rely solely on animals for their very survival. Livestock can also offer a buffer in national and international food supplies, which can be drawn upon in case of food shortages. A lack of rainfall, hailstorms, prolonged winters, or other unforeseen natural catastrophes can cause many plant-based crops to produce lower yields or even to fail completely. If we are to ever become completely vegetarian, people living in colder or drier regions would need to either abandon their homes for literal greener pastures, they would have to import all of their greens from somewhere else, especially during the winter months, or they'd have to make use of large-scale modern technology such as indoor vertical farming. Number 3. Lowering the risk of an apocalyptic disease. One of the biggest threats to humanity has always been disease. In the first quarter of the 20th century, during World War II, an influenza outbreak, also known as Spanish flu, was responsible for 5 times the number of deaths that resulted from the war itself, over 50 million people. It was so contagious, and it happened so fast that in less than a year, more than 500 million people, a quarter of the world's population at the time, was infected all across the planet. Only a small, isolated island somewhere in the Amazonian basin reported no infected. The reasons here were similar to those above: domesticated animals. With the discovery of antibiotics sometime after, the deadly disease was more or less kept in check since then. But more recently, however, due to the large quantities of antibiotics animals are given to prevent such an outbreak, as well as our own improper use of them, new strains of influenza have become resistant to the drug. These are the swine and avian flus that we hear about in the news from time to time. If for whatever reason a new global pandemic were to arise, it will most likely be from here, particularly because we're again left defenseless against them. In an attempt to get a possible heads up in the case of one such apocalyptic event, especially now that we're more connected than ever, scientists have been mapping areas with high concentrations of livestock all across the globe. They hope this will help them better predict from where the next outbreak is most likely to occur, Again, if we were to become vegetarian, this risk would be seriously lowered. Number 2. The livestock industry is more than just about the meat. As a whole, the livestock sector makes up about 1.4% of the world's GDP. It is also growing faster than the rest of the agricultural sector, which itself is declining relative to the overall GDP. In total, the livestock sector makes up 40% of all agriculture, and in most industrialized countries, it reaches as high as 50 or even 60%. If everyone were to become a vegetarian, these people would be out of a job. But besides meat, livestock also contributes with dairy products and eggs. But for argument's sake, let's consider those not a part of any vegetarian's diet. However, animal products also come in other forms as well, such as wool, leather, and fats. And while the first two are used in textile, furniture, and other businesses, animal fats and similar byproducts have a wide range of unexpected uses. These include things such as detergents, shampoos, and even condoms, as well as many others. Now, it wouldn't make any ethical or economic sense to raise livestock just for the sake of their leather or fats, so plant-based alternatives need to be considered. This will mean that much of the land used for feed, as well as many pasture lands, will need to be covered with these plants instead of returning to their natural state. Number 1. Our nutrition. We have to make one thing clear right from the start here. Animal protein, due to the fact that it's similar to our own, tends to deliver us all of the amino acids we need, whereas plant-based proteins lack one or more of these. One way to combat this is to have a wide range of grains, fruits, and vegetables at our disposal so as to compensate each other. In 2003, livestock-based food contributed an average of 17% of energy and 33% of protein to dietary intakes around the world. These numbers, of course, vary wildly from one country to another, as we've seen previously. This distribution of meat in our diets has left many people to suffer from different ailments related to their nutrition. According to a recent study, 2.1 billion people, that's roughly 30% of the world's population, are either obese or overweight, whereas at the other end of the spectrum, almost 800 million people do not have enough food to lead a healthy life. People who suffer from malnutrition can benefit immensely from livestock-based foods. This is because they often suffer from a lack of protein or vitamin and mineral deficiencies, which are elements found in meats and dairy. Children, in particular, have been shown to benefit greatly from a moderate animal-based diet, regardless of if they're malnourished or not. Obese and overweight people, on the other hand, have their own series of diseases, like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and certain cancers linked to excess meat and dairy consumption. This group of people would benefit immensely from a lowered intake of red meat and animal fats in particular. In order for people to become vegetarian, everyone should be able to have access to a wide variety of plants, animal fats, and nuts on a daily basis.
So I really hope you enjoyed that speculative video. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We put out brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also, over there on the right, a couple of other of our videos that you might enjoy if you enjoyed this one. And thank you for watching.